Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us in our first webinar for the Sustainability in the Time of COVID-19 series. This webinar is being hosted by the Office of Sustainability at Lakehead University, and my name is Lita McKellar. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for Lakehead. So with the global pandemic, we thought a lot of people are spending a lot of time at home, and we wanted to offer a series that supports sustainability and connecting to nature, despite the fact that we are spending more time at home, many of us, than usual, and perhaps more time indoors as well. We know it's incredibly important to connect to the natural world for our mental, our emotional, our physical, our spiritual health. And it's also important to connect to our food. Even recently, the federal government has called on us to support more local food systems, and also growing our own food is one way to connect to the food chain and shorten the food chain. So this webinar is going to focus on the basics of growing microgreen indoors. They're great for beginners because you don't need a lot of equipment, you can do it indoors, and you can have results in 2 weeks. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. So today we have Lakehead's greenhouse manager, Keri Pidgen. Hi, Keri.
Hello.
And she's going to be presenting in this webinar, and we're really grateful to Keri for being on board to put this presentation together. If you've ever visited Lakehead's greenhouse while she was managing it, you know she has a green thumb. And she's also committed to making food growing accessible. If you've ever gone online to learn how to grow food and got lost in a vortex of rules and specific details and such, Keri is good at busting some of those rules and just making it as simple as possible, which I'm a big fan of. So we really would like to hear from you and add your voice to this conversation today. The last 15 minutes have been reserved for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to use the question and answer box on your Zoom panel. If you see someone else asked a question that you also had, you can upvote it, and that'll ensure it goes higher in the roster and more likely to be answered. We're a little bit of a smaller group today than some other webinars, so we'll see, maybe we can answer all the questions. Because we are a smaller group, we are going to try allowing questions during the presentation. There is a raise a hand feature, so you feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. I'd ask that you please keep the question during the presentation relevant to what Keri is discussing, and if you're on the borderline, you can save it to the end. And there's also a chat box, so if you have comments or technical issues, you can use that chat box as well. Maybe you want to add to the conversation a little bit. Yeah, I think that sounds good. So please also note that this webinar is recording. We may provide it on our website after. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it over to Keri. So take it away, Keri.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Lita. I will note that I was looking forward to having the chat box, and I know plants, I don't really know computers that well, and so all I see is my little picture and the screen that I'm sharing. I don't know how to see the chat box as well, but Lita can direct me if there's anything relevant, I hope. So as Lita mentioned, I am the greenhouse manager here at Lakehead University. I do that as well as I'm also a technician in the natural resources program, so forestry and forest health programs. And I teach people about identifying native plants within the area, herbs and trees, and some other various things. We do a lot of flower dissecting, super fun. But one of my passions really is growing food and also growing medicine. So I really believe in growing your own food and producing your own medicines and things like that are really a great way to take the power back, so to speak. So I feel like so many of us, and it's really obvious now, I feel like while I'm waiting in line to get into a grocery store, to realize how dependent I am on the structures of our society. So dependent on the grocery store for all of my foods, dependent on going to the doctor when I have a problem. So it really brings it to the forefront for me, and I think for a lot of other people, that you know, to be as self-sufficient as possible and to localize things as much as possible is really an awesome way to go. So one way of doing that is microgreens. So a lot of people, students in particular, we have a very long winter here. I'm sure you all know that. So one way of having really local greens and edible foods that you're producing in your own house is through microgreens. So I have a little picture here showing, and this is lovely, like my situation never looks beautiful like this, but it could. So we have a nice little window farming, so a little window garden, which I think is a wonderful term, window farming. And so these people are growing some small sprouts. So this isn't my setup. Mine would never look this neat and tidy. But let's just go through. We're going to talk a little bit about what is a microgreen, why are they good for you, how do you go about doing it? Super easy. Just like growing of most plants, it's actually really easy, and we often just make it more complicated than it needs to be. So sustainability. So I just have some pictures of like I've worked on rooftop gardens when I lived out in Vancouver for a company. I also worked on green walls. So the top picture is a rooftop garden producing food right in the midst of a city in space that is otherwise not being used to produce food. So it just seems like a win-win kind of situation. Down in the bottom right, this is a green wall. This is at Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, and I worked for a company that put these in. And so this is purely ornamental, although you could argue that it's also greening up the air, cleaning up the air, adding oxygen. But the same kind of principles can be used for growing food. Another method of improving food production, especially in urban centers and places where space is limited, is vertical gardening. So on the bottom left, there's a really cool kind of hydroponic towers. I think there's some stuff going on with Roots to Harvest in town, doing some hydroponic, little hydroponic towers that they provide, and I've seen them, they're pretty cool. And so this is an example where you can produce so much more in a small space than otherwise, but we can bring this right down into our own living space and look at windowsill farming or countertop farming even, and looking at things like microgreens and sprouts. So in your own home or garden, in your own home or apartment, sorry, you can produce your own food. It is so easy. If you've ever gone to like the growing season and they have those amazing lentils that they put on top of the salads that I just love. I think if people only realized how easy it is to produce things like that on your own counter, then maybe more people would just have this kind of stuff going all the time. Again, especially in the winter. So sprouts, I'm not particularly talking about sprouts, but sprouts are along the same line. And really, it's just an earlier stage of development than what we're harvesting when we harvest microgreens. And they need even slightly less inputs into them. So we have a picture of a little sprout jar here. There's also this really cool idea for repurposing bottles and hanging them in your windows, a nice little window garden. This is showing herbs and lettuce. And down here at the bottom, we have some microgreens. So it can be really simple, or if you are a complicated type of person or like to get really involved, or maybe you're not working right now, like a lot of people, and have nothing but time and all sorts of motivation on your hands, you can get really fancy with it. So super easy way, and it's really fast way to add fresh green food to your diet. It can take as little as a week, depending on the species, up to, maybe even upwards of closer to a month, depending on your conditions and what species you're growing. So the turnaround is really fast, and it is, as I have here, as local as it gets. It's your own counter. It's so fresh because you are basically cutting off the top of the plant and putting it into your food immediately. There is zero wait time. Nothing like, buying things from the grocery store and it's kind of wilted, or I love bean sprouts that you buy from the grocery, like the kind that you buy from the grocery store. But if you ever pick up the bags and you kind of look at it, and it's kind of slimy in there, and I always feel like, you know what, I don't think I'm going to buy them, because I don't know, right? It looks a little bit not fresh. So you can produce your own, super easy, and it's as fresh as it gets. It's really cheap it can basically be free. The only thing you really need to get a hold of is some seeds and some soil, and that can actually be free as well if you repurpose some stuff or forage for your own. Lots of variety. And you can also use it in salads. You can put it on sandwiches, add them into stir fries. So all sorts of purposes, basically into anything that you have. And if they start growing too big, you can just add them to some soup just as a bit of extra vegetables and greenery and stuff. So not only are they really accessible, they're also really nutritious. So seeds they're basically little packets of, it's like setting yourself off with a lunch, to go and get through the day of work. It's the same kind of thing. Like, so these little seeds, these little embryos within a seed are sent from their parent plant with a bunch of nutrients. So seeds themselves have a lot of nutrients to them. That's really great. But once you start to sprout or allow that seed to grow, then those nutrients become a lot more accessible. So they're kind of on lockdown to begin with, and they're in storage mode. Once they become soaked, then enzymes are released, and that starts kind of breaking down things and resulting in the production of different proteins, or breaking down proteins and releasing amino acids, using up some of the starch. And so, like, for example, we can see there's a little table here. I mean, there's a lot of numbers. Kind of looks complicated, but it's not really. Just looking at protein, for example, so the protein available goes up as germination occurs and as growth occurs. Fat also is going up. So this is good thing. These are good things for your body. Starch, on the other hand, is going down. So starch is really just a carbohydrate. So like a fast, quickly available carbohydrate kind of thing. So your body breaks it down. It's like, that's what's in potatoes and stuff like that. So your body breaks that down and turns it into sugar really fast. So we're reducing some of that starch and adding more protein, and so some would argue making them more nutritious. So seeds are alive. They're just very dormant. Plants, on the other hand, or growing plants, have a lot of different metabolic processes going on. And so when we bring that seed to life by sprouting it and by germinating it, then we are creating, or we are allowing all of these different metabolites to become available, both primary, which are like energy sources, so things that we need to actually grow, and also secondary things, which are kind of peripherally beneficial, like, so they can be good for our, like, different vitamins that we receive from them, things that are good for our health and growth, but not necessary. Like, you could probably live maybe eating just McDonald's, but that's just pure primary metabolite. So there's no secondary green goodness going on in there. I mean, that's arguable. So let's talk a little bit about what a seedling is and how we go from a seed to a seedling, and to what we would call a microgreen, which is just a slightly larger sprout, right? So we start from a seed. Our seed absorbs water. There we go. That's called imbibition. So our seed absorbs water. And the first thing that then happens is the seed sprouts out a root. So inside the seed, there is a food source, and there's also an embryo. And so once that water is absorbed, it starts a chemical process that releases all of that stored energy, or some of that stored energy, and allows for growth. So then we have something like a radicle, and beyond that, we start getting into cotyledons, which these are, if you break a bean in half and you look at the two sides of the bean, those are the two cotyledons for a bean. So those are basically, another term is called a seed leaf. So they're leaves that are inside the seed. They're making up the bulk of the seed. And so those cotyledons come out. That is basically the end of where you would have a sprout. And then we move on to like a really small plant. At that point, we have our first leaves coming out, and the plant is extending beyond that, growing both up into shoots and down into roots. Okay, so see, I thought I had a bit of animation going on here, but my circles just showed up immediately. That's okay. So we have different kinds of germination. I showed one in the last slide. Okay, so we have just, this is just a basic, like a soybean plant. There's other kinds. So our first picture here, don't worry about the terms being epigeel or anything like that. But our first one, we have the cotyledons, where our seed leaves actually get pulled up out of the soil and are in the air. Okay, and then we have our new seed leaves growing. And these cotyledons are really funding the growth. They're providing the energy for the growth of these new leaves. There's also hypogeel germination, and that's basically like, so this would be a bean, and this would be like a pea. So peas differ a little bit in that the cotyledons stay underground. They don't actually come out as seed leaves. They stay underground, and just the true leaves come up above the soil level. Similarly, if we look at monocot, so plants that have just a single cotyledon, like grasses and things like that, the seed and whatnot stays underneath the ground, and just that above shoot, that one shoot comes up above the soil. So we can think, these are basically, I have these red circles around here, and those red circles are indicating basically where we might use something in the sprout stage. So if we were just growing something in a jar with no soil, just water, that's kind of the stage that we would eat it at. And because with the sprout, you're eating the root as well as the shoot, it makes a lot of sense if you're eating something like peas, right? If you sprout something like that, you're going to eat the whole thing. Whereas if you wait until it's a microgreen and cut it off, oh, there we go. And wait until it's a microgreen and cut it off, then we're actually going to be losing all of that stuff below the surface. So anything left in the cotyledon or in the seed leaf would actually not be a part of what you're digesting. That said, pea microgreens are really super if you go to the market at all, and it's been a little while since I've been there. But there is someone there that sells the microgreen shoots, and they're like, they'll have big bags of pea shoots, and they are just so wonderful. And in fact, if you grow peas in your garden, you can just nip off the ends of the pea shoots and throw those into your salad, and they're really good. Okay, so along the, okay, wait, there's something flashing up here. Does that matter to me? Probably not. Okay. It's a little bit awkward because I can't see anybody, and so I really don't know what's going on. I feel like I'm just presenting to my computer, to my wall in my office right now. So, okay, so basically we have sprouts, right? So we can still see the seed coat on there, and just a little root. Sometimes you get a bit of cotyledon if the seed coat is coming off. Move it onto a microgreen in the middle. So in this case, we're just going to be harvesting off of the soil. We just take scissors and trim them right off. And then up to baby greens. So we get a lot of that in the grocery store. You might buy baby spinach, like those little tubs of baby spinach or baby arugula and things like that. And so they're just at a larger stage than a microgreen, but maybe not quite as a full-grown mature plant. So just all things along a scenario system. So they're basically, what I'm trying to think of the word, but a continuum. There we go. Basically just selecting areas on a continuum, but there's no real stage where it's like, oh, here it's a sprout, here it's a microgreen, here it's a baby green. That's all just different aspects of the same thing. So sprout versus microgreen. I think probably, we would look at something and know the difference, but let's quantify it. Why not? So sprouts are really fast. You can have a sprout ready in less than a week, sometimes just a few days, depending on what species it is. Definitely less than a week. You don't need any soil, and you are eating the root and maybe the cotyledons, depending on how long you've sprouted it for. And they actually don't need any light. So they're not producing any true leaves. It's just super fast. There are recommendations that any grains or nuts or anything like that we eat really should be sprouted because it makes them so much more nutritious for us. Like some of the things like the tannins are reduced and phytic acid is reduced when we sprout something. So we're changing the form of some of the stuff within a seed, and making that seed much more digestible in our systems. Microgreens take it a little further and require a little more effort. So we're looking at 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the species and your conditions, like temperature, light, things like that. You need some soil or other kind of growing media. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm using soil really loosely here because we don't usually use outdoor soil. It's like a potting mix, basically. It's going to have at least cotyledons, but generally you'd be growing it to the point of having true leaves. And you need light, either a nice sunny window or you could use a grow light. These days there's compact fluorescent light, so you can just take a small bulb and fit it into a lamp, any of the lamps you have around your house, and use that to supplement your plant growth as well. So that's really convenient. And this is basically the things that we need to start. So if you're planning on doing it, as Lita was saying, we don't really need a lot to get started with it. We can use a container, like literally you can use almost anything. I'm probably not the only one that's been doing a lot of takeout lately. And so like a bit of Thai kitchen, leftover, and these are really big microgreens at this point because I started them a little bit early for the presentation. And then by the time I realized I didn't have time to start new ones, so they're a little bit large. But like just a takeout container like that is great. Other things I have are like just a standard pot, and then you can use anything you want, or a regular, almost lost it there, a regular greenhouse tray. This one's a little sparse, but a regular greenhouse tray will work fine as well. So we need a container, potting soil or some other media that we can grow in that's going to basically anchor the roots and provide a place for them to absorb water. Speaking of which, we also need water, of course, light, and seeds. So water and light are pretty well available anywhere. We probably also have containers anywhere because you could even use a bowl or a cup from your cupboard. So that is really accessible. The only two things you're really going to have to worry about getting are potting soil or potting mix and some kind of seeds. But we'll go through each of the things. So container, as I mentioned, really anything. I really like the clamshell containers that maybe you get lettuce in or other kind of produce at the grocery store, like in the middle here. One of the reasons that I really like it is because seeds grow better if they stay moist. And so if you close the lid on it while those seeds are germinating, you're going to get way better and faster germination. So higher germination, much faster. And then once they germinate, you'd want to take the lid off, but it's a really good option to have that. But basically anything that can hold your soil or media. And your media, there's so much variety in terms of what you can use for a potting mix. There's like usually the stuff that we buy at a store around here might have like peat moss and compost and some perlite or vermiculite, depending on what brand it is. But there's lots of different varieties. You could get stuff with coir, which is coconut fiber. The benefit of coconut fiber is that it lasts a really long time, so you can reuse that multiple times. Peat moss tends to break down a little more fast. And so, but the whole point is that you have some part of it that's going to be holding moisture, which would be our peat moss and compost. It's going to be also providing aeration. So you wouldn't want to use pure peat moss because it becomes really dense and compacted and it doesn't have a lot of space for air. So adding something like perlite or vermiculite just creates air pockets in the soil because roots need air. So the media doesn't have to be special, but it just has to do those two things. So it has to hold water and the roots and hold moisture. Or sorry, hold moisture and hold air. So it has to do those two things. Don't use garden soil. Like never ever put garden soil in a pot, no matter what it is that you're growing. It compacts very heavily. We don't have the same processes like critters and other microorganisms and stuff going into soil that is breaking it up. So when it's in a pot, becomes very compacted and roots can't grow properly. And so your plants are really stunted. So always use a potting mix. You can also reuse your soil. The only thing I would suggest is to be cautious about it. If you're reusing soil, then you can build up a lot of microorganisms. And so you can end up with things like damping off, which I'll talk about in a minute, and other diseases or insect built up, things like that. And so if you're gonna reuse it, that you can just, like, I can't remember the specifics, but you probably just put it in the oven for a half an hour. I'm not sure what temperature. Google, I'm sure, can answer that. You can even put some in the microwave for a while, and that also will sterilize the soil and just prevent those diseases or insects from infecting your new crop. Yeah, I think that's good. Oh, right, I was looking up stuff and I found that you can actually even use burlap, which I thought was kind of interesting because I have a bunch of old coffee sacks that I had this great idea I was going to use as a planter. But they ended up breaking down and like the roots growing into the soil, and I lifted up the bag one day and the whole plant and soil just stayed where it was, and I just lifted up the sides of the burlap. But thinking of that could also be used. So other people suggest using things like fleece and other fabrics. So, I mean, these seem like interesting options. So depending on what you have around your house, you might stray away from the traditional potting mix. But like the potting mix is really inexpensive. So you don't need a lot of it for growing sprouts. So if we look at how thin this burlap is, it's super thin layer. You can grow these seeds in a really thin layer of soil. And the reason being that they don't need to take a lot of nutrients from that soil. You're harvesting them before they really become demanding, both in space or in nutrients or anything. You're harvesting them before that becomes a problem. So you don't need a lot of anything to grow them.
Keri?
Yeah.
Parker is wondering if you can use sawdust as a growing medium.
Oh gosh, I expect you could. I mean, the only thing that I would think about would be having a little bit more aeration depending on the grain of the sawdust. So if you, okay, so a couple things. If you have a very fine sawdust, then that might not be aerated enough. Maybe you could add, like, if you also have some bark chips, things like that, that might provide a little more structure. And then I would be really cautious about what species of wood chips you're using. Like, so some species are toxic. Like if you were to use a cedar or something like that, it could be really hard on the plant. So I know that a lot of mixes use bark as a basis for potting soil. Less use wood, but I think that the reason less use wood is because wood is really, the breakdown of wood by fungi is really nitrogen dependent. So there's a lot of carbon, so you need a lot of nitrogen in order to break that down. But maybe for a short-term thing like a sprout, it might be okay as long as you provided the aeration. And if it's a pretty neutral species, like a poplar or birch or something like that. I don't know. If you do it, let me know how it works out. I'd be interested to hear. Okay. Let me know if you have further questions about that. So water, I use filtered water. Like grown plants grown plants generally don't take up things like lead, and they don't incorporate those into their tissues. But when seeds are imbibing, so like this picture here is showing just some kidney beans starting to take up water. So if you've ever soaked beans, you know kind of what that looks like, where they start to wrinkle almost immediately. And then it takes about a day or 24 hours for them to really completely absorb water, and they'll double in size. But in my house, I live in an old house, and I'm one of those lucky Thunder Bay houses that have lead pipes. And so I'm like, I've just used filtered water. I use filtered water for everything in my house. Once plants are growing, I mean, you can water them with anything, and it's generally okay. But for the stage of absorbing water, I tend to use filtered water. There's other things like the chlorine and stuff like that. Like these things can just have a negative impact on seed germination and growth, as well as potentially your own health. What else did I want to say about that? I can't recall, but the room temperature. So ideally, you don't generally want to water with cold water. Nice room temperature water is the best. And before you plant anything, you really should wet the media. So I have here that peat is hydrophobic, which is as it sounds. So it's basically repels water. You can use a little dash of soap or just dish detergent. Just don't use a lot of it. Just a small dash of soap. So there's a little bit of foaming when you add that water. And that will break basically the surface tension and allow the peat to absorb the water. Because you want to make sure the media is nice and dry first. To plant in dry peat and then try and have it absorb water later is a really terrible battle that can see you like washing your seeds away as you overwater and things like that. But if you have that peat nice and wet first, then it's way better. You keep the seeds moist. So I mentioned using like a clam top or one of those clam kind of containers, and keep those seeds moist. Most seeds don't like light when they germinate. After they germinate, yes, but most seeds prefer to have soil over top of them to germinate. So usually I'll fill up my container with moist soil, I'll spread my seeds, and then I'll sprinkle a little bit more soil over top. And having a little bit of soil over top really helps them, keeps them moist, and provides the dark conditions that most seeds require in order to germinate. You can always, there's so much information, of course, online. You can always just Google a species if you aren't sure. A really general rule of thumb is that very small seeds often require more light, and where larger seeds often require less light or prefer darkness. That's just a rule of thumb. I mean, I don't even know if I actually don't even know if that's true. That's just what I've noticed in terms of my own growing of plants. But I mean, that might not be as ubiquitous as I think it is. Right, one last thing here. I have a picture of damping off. So I generally keep them covered with a clear cover until they germinate. Once a large number of seedlings have germinated, then I remove the lid. By keeping it really moist in there, you're preventing, well, for one thing, you're preventing any air circulation, and you're keeping that really moist condition, which is really good for fungal infection. And so damping off is a fungal infection. You may, if you've ever grown seedlings before, you may notice that they're doing awesome, they look lovely, and then all of a sudden they start falling over and withering, and you're like, well, it's not like, they look like they've dried out, but they haven't, because the soil is moist. And it usually starts as maybe an individual and then spreads as a patch. And so that's damping off, and it basically kills off the stem right at the soil line. And so then there's no way of moisture or anything going from the roots to the leaves, and so it just falls over and dies. Okay, so light. You can see on the left there, well, I mean, neither of these have probably an ideal amount of light, but definitely the picture on the left, the tray, does not have enough light. So you can see that the little seedlings are growing super long. They have these tiny little cotyledons for how long the stem is, and they're not really green at all. They're so pale looking. That's a pretty good indication that they don't have enough light. We would call that being leggy. So as these seedlings would continue to grow, they would have really long spaces in between the internodes. So their internodes would be really long. So that's basically the space in between leaves. So if you have really long spaces in between leaves, or leaves with really long stalks, spindly looking plants, then it's probably because they don't have enough light. And so we want to make sure we have a nice sunny window. You can also use LED lights or fluorescent or compact fluorescent lights. You probably need about 8 to 10 hours a day of light, and some need more. So things like sunflowers like even a lot more light, so they stay nice and compact and green. And I mentioned here as well that they do germinate best under dark conditions, but as soon as they've germinated, they all need light. They all need to start producing their own energy to fuel growth. So you do need light, unlike sprouts. These won't get very far without it because we are waiting ideally for those first true leaves to occur.
Shadia is wondering where she can purchase a grow light or lamp in town.
Oh gosh, okay. Well, like home, you can, a grow light. So there's so many options here. You can go and get a ballast or something from somewhere like Home Depot and just get something simple like a cool fluorescent light, like the cool temperature, which is just the wave. Like, I end up talking to where the speaker is because I hear your voice coming out. So then I start looking at that. So you can get like a ballast or something, but I mean, I feel like for the amount of light, if you just have a couple of lamps, you can get the compact fluorescent lights. I know a couple years ago I bought, I don't know that they were full spectrum, but they were particularly designed for growing plants, compact fluorescent bulbs from Bill Martin's Nurseryland, but I'm sure you can get them all over the place. So you can just use regular lamps and just put those around depending on if you're trying to just supplement natural light or if you're actually planning on growing solely under natural light conditions. But I would say like the hardware store, you can get that. It's more a matter of the bulb as opposed to the actual light. You can buy specific ballasts and grow lamps online, but as soon as you add in grow light or something like that, you're adding that niche term to it, and so you're going to double the price of anything you pay for. Plants like a lot of basically red and then kind of like a blue light. So if you can get a fluorescent light that just has the right wavelengths, just look it up. I feel like cool white light, fluorescent light is a really easy way to go, and it's really easy to get a fluorescent ballast. Okay, so seeds. I find, I guess as a plant person, I still find things that kind of throw me for a loop and make me really appreciate them even more. So I think about I love going to the bulk store, and I buy a lot of beans and other things there. And that's where I've started a lot of my sprouts and stuff. So I sprout lentils all the time. I sprout chickpeas, or I grow microgreens, like I have been doing here with stuff like lentils and beans. These are from the bulk zone. And it kind of is amazing that all of the seeds like that we would see in this picture here are actually alive. So we think of them as these dried, inert foodstuffs, right? But it's actually just little sleeping plants. Each one of those is a little sleeping plant. And it just kind of throws my mind for a loop. I love that. So if you were to take any of those beans and whatnot and soak them and then put them in soil, they would grow like this. These are pinto beans. These were pinto beans that I bought from the bulk zone. And as I said, they look like little dry, inert pieces of food, but they're actually little sleeping plants in there. And so as long as the seed is alive, then you can grow it. And so the list of species that you can actually use to create microgreens it's huge. It's like any vegetable that you eat. Maybe not any fruit, but definitely any vegetable that you eat, you can grow as a microgreen. So a lot of these are available through any kind of seed ordering type of site. So this is like, for example, a list from microveggie.com, and that's just based on what they sell. But it's a nice list of just showing you the extent of some of the different things you can grow. And I think that's probably the most exciting part about this for me, is that all of the different types of things. And I really like growing herbs. So things that you would generally use as flavoring. So they have a really strong flavor, and you don't need a lot of them in order to impart that flavor in your food. So things like marjoram or mint or anything like that. And you can grow it. You can grow a nice tray of it super easily, and you're adding so much to your food simply by doing that. So a little bit of seed biology, just so that we know what's going on, just because it's interesting. I mean, I'm a biologist by training, so this is kind of my thing, but a little bit of seed biology. So the seeds that we're using are alive. They are sleeping. So they're just dormant, waiting for the right conditions in order to allow for germination. So inside every seed, if you break open a pea or a bean and you look in between the two halves, so the halves, like this whole half here is one cotyledon, which is a seed leaf. And then in between the two seed leaves, right, so this is like if we were to take a bean in half, we have basically a baby plant or an embryo. And here we have the embryonic leaf, okay, and we have the embryonic root or the radicle. And that's all in here, and it's just waiting to absorb water and be activated. And that root then will break through the seed coat, and the cotyledons will emerge as well. And then we have that new leaf, the true leaf, coming out after the cotyledons. So there's a little embryo in there, and as long as the seed is alive, it can germinate and become a sprout or become a microgreen. We're just waiting for the right conditions. So all of our vegetable seeds are super easy to germinate. We have grown them to be really easy to germinate. If you try and grow any of the wild plants, it can be a little more difficult. Sometimes they need some pretty significant stratification or extra treatment. So it's not they're not just dormant because they don't have any water. They're dormant because they are designed to stay dormant until winter is done. And they have to have ways of determining that winter has actually passed. And it's not just, hey, we had some snow in October and now it's December and we're having a warm week. They have to know not to germinate then. So there's like an extended period of cold that they need to undergo. But most of our vegetables and whatnot are ready to go as long as they aren't too old. So if you leave seeds for a while, we know that they become less viable over time. If you've tried to grow vegetables from like 2 years ago, you might be reducing your germination to about half, and then if we go 3 years ago, then you might be down to like 20%, right? So you get less and less as time goes on, and really depending on what conditions as well you're growing them in. So we have an embryo and we have food reserves in that. And all we're doing when we grow a plant into a small stage, so a microgreen stage, is we're just allowing all of those really packed in stored nutrients, we're just allowing them to activate and just to activate and actually become a lot more available for us to eat. Okay, I have a little note here. Make sure you buy living dormant seeds. So if they've been roasted or treated in some way, or my husband was making, we do a lot of fermentation kind of stuff. So he was making something, some kind of a drink, and he had barley, and then he tried sprouting it, and it just went moldy on the counter. And it was like, oh, okay, no, wait, this isn't like sproutable barley. This is just treated eating kind of barley. So you just be careful about what you're growing or what you're buying, and make sure that it, like if you're buying it from a food store, and make sure that it's actually something that will grow.
Keri?
Yeah?
We're just about at 2:15, which is when we had said we'd end. So if you have an extra, 15, 20 minutes, we could keep going, and those who are able to stay with us can.
Okay, well, you know what? I've got like 2 seconds here. I'm just gonna breeze through it, okay?
But we'll just let the folks know that we'll stay around for a bit so they can ask their questions.
Okay.
Good. All right, thanks.
So wait, so Lita, like I've taken up question time too?
Yes, but
I'm so sorry.
Hopefully folks have the ending at 2:15, they don't have anything till 2:30, and so we can go on a bit.
We're all so busy these days.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'll just breeze through it anyways. I'm sorry for taking so long. I have no clock in front of me, and I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. Basically, when you're storing seed, you want to keep them not moist, and you want to keep them nice and cool. There's some rules of thumb, so I don't really need to go through it. It doesn't matter. The point is, keep them dry and cool. If you don't, just know that germination will be reduced because of that, because some of the seeds will die. So where do you get seeds? So you can order bulk seeds from places, any kind of seed place, like the Ontario Seed Company, for example. Bulk food stores, you can buy it. I also know that you can collect a lot of wild seeds. There's lots of weedy plants that are actually really edible and super nutritious. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. I think next week's webinar is about foraging. So hey, more on that for next week, I guess. There's some of the problems you might encounter, but you're not doing it. So I mean, most times problems come up when you're actually doing a thing. It's hard to anticipate them. But some of the things that might come up, like just with germination and if things are dying off, you can just have a look, and that might help you out if you want to look at this later. Okay, I was going to do demo and question time, but I need to stop sharing. There we go. And so I guess any questions, but I can just show you the few things that I have here. So I kind of pointed these out. I've got some lentils that I sprouted and some, I believe these were pinto beans. Again, these are like macrogreens. Now, they're a little bit bigger than I would ideally take them, but I mean, I'm still gonna eat them. I might just cook them instead of just eating them raw because they'll be a little tougher. It's not that they're not edible at this point. It's just that they become tougher, that's all. And so they're less soft and juicy. Okay, I don't know that I'm gonna demo. I'll see if anyone has any questions.
There's a question from Paul who says, thanks for sharing. How do you, I think that he meant to say, how do you control damping off?
Oh, right. Well, ideally, if you can use clean soil. So if you're reusing soil and you're getting damping off, then it's probably surviving in the soil. Another thing is having aeration, so you can have air movement, have a fan, and things like that. Once you have damping off started in a pot, just harvest it because it can be really tricky. You can't really stop it very well. I know from my own experience of growing seedlings, I'm not sure in terms of like growing things for food, but I always used cinnamon. And cinnamon can be really good fungicide that's natural. So you can sprinkle cinnamon on the surface or make a cinnamon spray. There's instructions online. You can make a cinnamon spray and spray your seedlings and stuff with it. I don't know to what extent I would do that with microgreens because there's such a fast turnaround that I probably would just harvest it and start a new batch.
Awesome. We also have a question. Is consistent temperature super important?
I don't think so. No, like, so they have each plant has a range, generally anywhere between 70 and 80 degrees is ideal for germination for most species. Once they've germinated, the temperature is much less important. I think that when they're germinating, you'd like to keep them warm. If they have a nice sunny window, that heating up of the soil during the day would be adequate to probably spark germination. So, it's going to be really species dependent. If you're having trouble with a thing, then I would maybe look up the species that you're trying and just see. Like some will grow in cooler temperatures, like spinach happily will grow in cooler temperatures, where other things like beans might require warmer temperatures.
Great. There's another question. What's the best way to store seeds and how long will they last?
Again, that's so species dependent. Just like, so if you've ever tried to cook beans that you bought, like I was under the impression until very recently, about the time when I bought my Instant Pot, which I can't recommend enough, that beans basically were a thing that you could keep in your cupboard and they would last forever. And then, but I was having all this trouble cooking kidney beans, and I was like, God, they're always they don't ever get soft, right? And so like if you keep beans in your cupboard for a year, they basically do not soften well unless you have a pressure cooker. So similarly, like if you're trying to keep a seed just for growing, once you get beyond a year, then it becomes more difficult. So they're alive, they're sleeping, but they're still breathing, right? So they still need to be undergoing metabolic functions. It's just really slow. It's kind of like being in hibernation. And so they can die over time. They can only sustain that for so long, and they die. And different species can last longer than others. Really large seeds don't usually last as long as smaller seeds. I guess maybe just more stuff is going on. I'm not exactly sure why. More water loss, I suppose, and stuff like that. But the smaller seeds and some seeds are meant to dry out and last for longer. So it really depends on the species. The best way is just to dry them and keep them somewhere cool. A lot of times if you dry them right out and freeze them, things can last a really long time. Obviously you don't want to freeze them when they're not dry, because then the cells will burst and your seeds will die. So make sure they're dried first. They would last a fairly long time that way, but as long as you keep them somewhere cool and dry, they should last fairly well for a couple years at least. It's going to depend on the species though.
Perfect. Jesse says they have a frame for a greenhouse, but they're looking for a material to cover the frame.
Right.
It's 10 by 20 feet long and 8 feet high. And they're wondering what material they could use to cover the frame.
Okay, so like you're just looking for something to like extend your season a little bit, probably. I mean, you can just, okay, plastic, right? But that is so broad. I don't know, and I've actually never built a greenhouse. I bought greenhouse kits that I've had, and it was just like some kind of plastic, fairly thick plastic coating and plastic sheet, basically. You can make a really cheap one just buying from those rolls of plastic at Home Depot and like staple it on, you know, but you can actually buy, given, like if it's like a hoop house frame, you can buy very specific greenhouse plastic for it. I don't know where exactly you go for that. You'd have to just Google it. I mean, I know a fair amount about plants. I don't know a lot about greenhouse construction, although I would like to, but I don't, yeah.
Next webinar. We have a question. What is the minimum depth of soil for microgreens?
I don't know. I feel like I use too much soil, and so I end up wasting it. I don't think you need as much because you're harvesting them so quickly. So like, I don't know if I have a minimum, but I generally would probably put in like an inch of soil.
I've also heard an inch.
Yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable amount. It's gonna give them enough structure. Part of that is being able to hold enough water. So once you have a thing filled with plants like this, like if you have only an inch of soil, they're going to go through any water that you pour in really fast because they're all just transpiring. So, I mean, I guess you could set them in a dish of water, but you know, you would harvest them before they really got this big. So. But I would say an inch would be about the minimum. You can use more, but using more doesn't really make things that much better unless you plan on, hey, I'm going to be gone for a few days, or maybe the species has a really significant root. You know, they all do have some different requirements.
Perfect. We have another question. Once you snip off the microgreen, does it continue to grow?
Not really. So it's going to kind of depend on the species. So I talked about epigeal and hypogeal shoots. So in some cases, the cotyledon is below the soil. And if you cut off above the soil, there is a chance, probably you're not going to have significant regrowth, but they could in some cases resprout from that, from below the ground. But in terms of things that have their cotyledons above the ground like this here, when I cut this off, there's not a lot of storage in that root. And so the root doesn't really have the ability to send up a new plant after that point. So no, at that point, it's not going to grow up. I think like the short answer is no, you're done at that point. Although in certain species, you could get some regrowth, but I don't think it would be significant enough.
Great. Parker is wondering, do you recommend using some weights on top of the seeds while they germinate?
No.
Or they germinate, maybe.
No, okay, so no, I would use some soil. Other people use like germinating fleece or like there's certain fabrics you can get, or even a paper towel. People will wet and set that on top. I usually just use a bit of soil. When they start to germinate, you'll see like the seeds come up, and often they'll have like a whole layer of soil that they're pushing up on top of them. And I just kind of water that off and back onto the soil. So if you just spray them, give them a decent little water, all of that will fall back down, and you're left with just the actual vegetation instead of the hulls in the soil. If I don't know if that's kind of what you mean, but like I would just put the seeds down and put a thin layer of soil, and then once they germinate up, you can kind of just water it so that anything that came up with the plants as they germinated just falls back down. Like, 'cause you'll see that they all germinate basically at the same time, and so they can take up that top layer of soil with them, and so you kind of have like a canopy. But if you just water it, then it just goes back down. I'm sure you could just shake it off too, or rinse them when you actually harvest them. Or, you know, a lot of people use paper towel. My thought is that isn't it going to kind of stick? Like, depending on the size of the seed, I feel like little germinating seeds might just stick to the paper towel. But I just haven't tried it, so maybe it's fine.
Perfect. We have one more question currently. Sure. From Susan, who asks, if you are using a fabric to grow your microgreens, should you still cover the seeds with soil or something else?
You probably would just do 2 pieces of fabric. Like, most seeds do want darkness in order to germinate, and having something on top would allow them to have both moisture encasing them and also prevent the light. So I haven't grown with fabric, but I believe so. I believe that you would have another piece of fabric over top. But I mean, if you're using fabric, then, you know, you probably wouldn't put soil over top, right? Otherwise, you might as well just use soil to begin with. But like paper towel, I guess, or another piece of fabric, yeah, you would still want to put something over top.
Perfect. There's no questions, although I had just one. I know before we put the webinar together, we were talking about you can buy microgreen packets, and often if they say microgreen seeds, there's a bit of an extra charge because they're microgreens, whereas you could get the same seeds just under their own name. And you had said something about when you buy the mixed seed packets, that's not always best. Can you elaborate on why it's not necessarily good to have a mixed seed microgreen packet?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I find the same thing, and I think of the same thing when I see bean mixes for soups and stuff, and I'm like, but they all need different times. They all need different times to cook. Like, some are big seeds and some are small seeds. But I mean, just look at the size difference between these two. They were started at the same time. Okay, so if you buy mixed packets, things germinate at different rates. They grow to different heights, and it can just be hard to actually have them grow together, right? So some grow faster than others, and some grow taller than others. So it just can be tricky in terms of trying to grow all that together. I feel like it's much better to just grow a single species. You don't even need a large pot. You could grow them in a cup, right? And just grow one species separate. Yeah, and as you were talking about in terms of buying seeds, yeah, I think as soon as you write microgreen into a search engine, you're probably doubling the price. Just like adding grow lights in front of a light fixture, you're going to double the price. I mean, my favorite thing is just to go to the bulk zone. It's like, I mean, I usually buy organic stuff, so I think it's like 60 cents for 100 grams. Like, so this is like 10 cents of seeds or something, right? So depending on what you want to grow, if you want to grow really specific stuff, like you really want to grow radish and you really want to grow these things, then you can buy bulk radish like I showed from certain places. And you can get them for cheaper. Just don't try and search out microgreens, because there's people, you know, that you always pay for a niche kind of thing. Other thing is collecting your own. So if you have a garden, you'll find, like I've found with collecting seeds myself, that I can collect, for most things, I can collect so much more than I would pay a huge amount for the amount that I've collected off of like 2 plants. And I would pay a huge amount for someone else to give me like a 10th of that. So I feel like a lot of times we can just collect our own. You can go and collect lots of wild seeds, which are like amaranth, super healthy food. you can buy amaranth seed, for example, but there's lots of wild species that grow in gardens all around that we all weed out, but you don't have to. And like lamb's quarters, really tasty food. They produce lots of seeds. It's so easy to collect it. So, there's lots of options. In terms of pea shoots, I don't know. I always buy like a bulk thing of peas from like West Coast Seeds. So it's probably not the most cost effective. I usually just eat my pea shoots. I usually just collect off my pea plants that I grow in my garden because we love fresh peas. And so we grow them all the time in the garden, but I'll always, when I'm making a salad, I'll always just go out and pinch off the shoots. I don't know, I haven't grown them as greens. Sorry, I was answering a question.
No, that's perfect. I saw that in the chat there. It was, I almost missed it. So I guess we should think about wrapping up. I don't see any open questions. I wonder if you might just show us a quick demo and then maybe we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, well, I do have a few things. So just like, this is so low profile, or so low pro here. Okay, so basically I have a little takeout container. I had brought some food with me to work, left over from wherever. I've got a little pile of seeds, and so I'm just gonna kind of show, I'm not even gonna put holes in the bottom of this because I'm not growing them for very long. I am not that worried about drainage. Probably there are people who are gonna be like, what do you mean you're not putting holes in the bottom? I'm also growing things in a greenhouse here. So like there is so much water evaporation happening. I don't have to worry about things being still. You can put a few holes in the bottom if you wish. So basically I would just put in an inch of soil. Maybe, about an inch. And I'm not gonna pack it down. I think our tendency is often to pack the soil down to just like make sure everything's in its place. But don't do that because remember the two important things that we want in our soil. One is water. It's still going to hold water, but what it's not going to hold if it's packed together is air. So we want to make sure that it's nice and loose and therefore aerated because that's really important for roots. They breathe just like we do, so they need oxygen in order to live. And it's funny because we always think about plants as producing oxygen, but just like all living things, they also need oxygen. Anything that's respiring needs oxygen. So I put that down. The soil is nice and damp, so I'm not worried about that. And I will just take my seeds. These are just buckwheat growths. Again, purchased from the bulk zone. And it's just like buckwheat seeds, which is not actually wheat. It's actually it's not a monocot. It's like a seed plant. It's a little different. But so I've got like a handful of these, and I would basically sow them really thickly. So you want to put a lot in each soil. If you look at images that I've shown about harvesting these things, like here, I've got some scissors. Like if I'm harvesting these, for example, they are so thick in here, like they're super dense. So we are putting a lot of seeds in there. So you don't want to buy expensive seeds because you use a lot of them for this. So, basically I'm just going to pile on the seeds. Like I've got a ton. I basically coated the whole surface of this with seeds. And I kind of want it to be even so that I have a nice even growth and all of them can germinate. And then I would take a little more soil and just spread it over top. And I just want so that I'm just covering the seeds. Like I don't want a lot of soil. It's almost like I'm basically looking at it now and it's like, okay, I can see a couple of seeds here and I'm just kind of covering those up, making sure that everything has just the tiniest little bit. And then I would spray it again. If you're using small seeds, you might not want to spray from above. You might want to make sure you have holes in the bottom and you can set it in a dish and allow the water to come up from underneath. Because if you have very fine seeds and you spray it with water, then the seeds are like flowing off and down the sides of the container and they're getting buried in the soil and they just won't germinate. So with really fine seeds, I would water from below. Okay, and that's it. Done. And then I would put a lid on it. I have a lid. Okay, and so now I'm just gonna put my lid on it. And I'm going to check it every day, make sure that it's watered. I should see germination within a couple of days, depending on the species. This one might take a little bit longer, might take 3 or 4 days. And you'll start seeing like a little root poking out from the seed. And then, within maybe a week or probably 2 weeks, they're ready to harvest. So they'll be grown up a few inches. You probably want them to be about 3 inches. And then you could just snip them off and throw them into your salad or sandwich or whatever.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Keri.
Great. I guess next time if I do one of these again, I will put a timer. we'll keep a watch nearby or a phone or something.
You did great. I could have warned you earlier. I think for our first webinar, I'm very pleased with that. And you may not have seen, but a few folks gave some feedback saying great information. So
awesome.
I guess we'll wrap it up since we are over time, but I really do want to thank Keri. I'll just turn my video on to say hi to everybody. Thank you so much to Keri. A lot of great information. Hopefully folks go out and start trying your own microgreens. If you do, feel free to send me your photos or tag Lakehead Sustainability on Facebook or Instagram. We'd love to see what you grow. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And if you don't know, we have another webinar next week on foraging. So feel free to tune into that. The link is on you can find it in all sorts of places, but you can email me if you can't find it. Yeah, good luck with the growing. I guess that's it. So have a great day.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.